A lot of people accuse the Chinese of trying to take over the world. I don't buy that for 1 minute. At the moment, they're just sitting back watching the Western world destroy itself, actually, with this, unnecessary war. Trump's tearing up alliances. The Europeans paralyzed by, inability to work together.
这里是胤蓝智库，美西方政客天天在国际上炒作中国威胁论，把咱们塑造成一个要吞噬全球的超级怪兽。但在最近，英国政坛上重量级大佬、前商业大臣文斯·凯布尔实在是看不下去了，直接在节目里撕下了西方阵营的最后一块遮羞布。他说了一句极其扎心的大实话：中国根本没有兴趣接管世界，人家只需端着茶杯，静静地看着西方怎么把自己给玩死的就可以了。咱们先看大背景，这几年美西方在自身衰落中焦虑，美国搞零和博弈，到处建小院高墙，甚至逼着欧洲老牌的盟友一起对中国搞技术封锁。英国更是一步一趋患上了重度被害妄想症，只要沾了中国2个字的企业或投资，一律扣上国家安全的黑帽子，宁可自断双臂也要强行脱钩。在这种反制的政治狂热下，文斯·凯布尔的访谈简直是一股清流。他面对主持人直接扔出了3个暴击，击一击来苏格兰建厂能解决几千人的就业，结果英国政府一句国家安全直接一票否决。凯布尔怒斥这不是防备，这是纯纯的偏执和妄想。第2击刺穿西方的遮羞布，别天天碰瓷中国了。现在的西方正在被无休止的战争拖垮，被欧洲的内斗瘫痪，被特朗普的退群撕裂，西方正在自杀，而中国只需要在一旁静静的攀登科技树。第3击残酷的经济真相，过去30年，西方占全球经济的比重已经从 60% 暴跌到 40%， 而以中印为首的新兴市场直接拿走了世界经济的大头。时代早已经变了，西方的霸权梦该醒一醒了。这位英国前内阁政臣到底是如何手撕西方强盗的逻辑呢？西方对中国的防备究竟是基于理智还是出于恐惧呢？咱们直接沉溺式看看这段信息量极大的原片，看完后胤蓝智库带你扒一扒中国真正的大国阳谋到底是什么。
In the past, NATO summits like the one held at Ankara this week were gatherings of the world's most powerful nations, a symbol of Western dominance. But as those allies increasingly disagree over issues like Ukraine, Iran and Greenland, other powers are gaining influence. In his new book, Eclipsing the West, the former Liberal Democrat leader and business secretary Sir Vince Cable argues that China and India are on track to become the most powerful countries in the world. And I'm pleased to say that Sir Vince Cable joins me now in the studio. Welcome to the show, Sir Vince.
Thank you for inviting me on.
It's very good to have you on. So tell us about your thesis that China and India are going to become the most powerful countries in the world.
Well, the argument is that while we have a lot of noise, and Trump particularly being a dominant figure on the world stage, wars and issues of that kind, there is something quietly happening under the surface. Since in the last 30 years, the share of the Western world in the world economy, the Western world being Europe, North America, Japan essentially, has shrunk from 60% to 40%. And the big emerging markets have gone the other direction, 40 to 60%. They now have the majority of the world economy, and this was led by China. China's now got some problems, but India is now the most rapidly growing major economy in the world by a long way. And you've got Vietnam, other countries in that region, even some of the more dynamic places in Africa beginning to motor. So the center of the world economy has moved. And, when the economy moves, a lot of things that you can deal with economies, like spending more on defense or prestige issues of various kind.
And of course, this leads to a whole host of questions that we can explore here. The first, I guess, is it a case, is it a case of either or can one argue, as the pie gets bigger, the world economy grows, everybody gets wealthier. China becoming richer does not necessarily mean the West must become poorer.
No, I think that's a very powerful and important point. And we are interdependent, and we should try to keep that. There are so many pressures at the moment to cut your links with one country or the other. Particularly the Trump view of the world, it's zero sum. If we gain, somebody else loses, vice versa. I think we should accept the fact that the reason why the world is in a much better place than it was at the end of the Second World War is that living standards have risen almost everywhere. And in poor countries, hundreds of millions of people have lifted out of poverty. It's the fact that we're interdependent and we traded a lot. And when you trade a lot, you become more vulnerable, actually. But that's part of having a world where people depend on each other, and we shouldn't walk away from international trade and the other aspects of globalization, as it's called.
You were the business secretary. In fact, I was one of your junior ministers, and you're an old China hand as well. You've spent time working in China, and we have this interesting situation now in the UK, partly driven by Washington, where almost any Chinese company is regarded with deep suspicion. You read stories about don't drive a Chinese car onto a military base, for example. But is there within your analysis a call for Britain to recalibrate and to understand perhaps that we should have good relations with China? They're going to be a significant trading partner.
Yeah, we should. We shouldn't be naive about it. There are a lot of bad things happening in China, and we're not dealing with Mother Teresa here. Very hard-headed and ruthless, and there are issues in which I'm sure they want to do us down. But you have to deal with them, and there are potentially mutual interests. I think we've made some bad mistakes. For example, recently, one of our best energy companies, Octopus Energy, had a collaborative project with the biggest wind turbine manufacturer in China to set up a big factory in Scotland, create thousands of jobs, bring the best wind farm technology to Britain. And it was vetoed by the British government on what they call national security ground. It was never explained what that meant, and I've probed into a little bit, and it's a bit insubstantial. There is an element of paranoia. We shouldn't be naive in dealing with China, but paranoia is the other extreme, and I think we've lurched a bit in that direction, partly under pressure from the US.
And what does the rise of India and China mean in terms of geopolitics? Because although we regard China with suspicion, it's not necessarily a country that's a sort of interventionist country. It has its issue with Taiwan, but India as well, outside of its own near region, does not seem a country that's going to get overly involved in international foreign affairs, or have I got that wrong?
You're quite right. They're not active outside the Indian subcontinent, and they're not yet, a great power. Arguably, on some measures, probably the third biggest economy in the world. But from India's point of view, their main preoccupation is holding the country together, lifting many, many more people out of poverty. There's still vast poverty in India, despite some very dynamic areas. And that's their preoccupation, and rightly so. The Chinese, there's a lot of people accuse the Chinese of trying to take over the world. I don't buy that for 1 minute. At the moment, they're just sitting back watching the Western world destroy itself, actually, with this, unnecessary war. Trump's tearing up alliances. The Europeans paralysed by, inability to work together. So there's not a great deal of active Chinese activity outside of business, but they're doing good business, and their exports are growing rapidly, and they have a near monopoly of some key technologies now, particularly in the green green technologies, but they're roughly a little bit behind the US in artificial intelligence and chips, advanced chips, things like quantum physics. They're probably now on a par, and the Chinese are just quietly building up their technological strength in the belief that in the long run this is what will take them to be number one.
And I mean, in terms of the changing the mindset of the British and how British business does international business, I'm very conscious that it feels that although we have a deep and long-standing history with India, we're very underpowered in how we engage with India. You know, when I was the minister responsible for the film industry, I talked to Hollywood all the time, but I never talked to Bollywood. And I remember having a conversation with the outgoing High Commissioner from India, who's just left, funnily enough, to go to China.
About Doraiswamy.
Yeah.
Very impressive guy.
Very impressive. Why don't we do more defence contracts? You know, build planes with the Indians. You know, we always think our natural partners are either the Americans or our European partners. So, do you feel that we're completely underpowered in terms of how we engage with Indian business?
Well, it's not just India. You know, Britain has become, sadly, very inward-looking. You know, the fact that we change our prime ministers in the way we change football managers doesn't help our credibility, and it means there isn't any real long-term thinking going on in Whitehall. But no, to the credit of the government and the last government, we have cobbled together an agreement with India which is quite far-reaching and opens markets, something your government did, which is to sign us up to an Asia-Pacific agreement, the CGTPP. I think I've got the acronym right.
The CPTPP.
Well done, thank you. It doesn't do much in the short run, but it does take Britain to the Asia-Pacific where much of the growth is. So it's not an entirely bad story, but I think in general, particularly since Brexit, you know, Britain has shriveled somewhat.
Absolutely. Well, I'm not going to disagree with you on that, although I'll get a lot of angry texts from Times Radio listeners about that. I mean, I said earlier that India and China don't strike me as kind of countries that are interventionists, but obviously as their wealth grows and their power grows, they will inevitably want to play their role on the national stage. I can see China is a sort of a clearer map, and there will be friction, particularly with countries like Japan and Australia, our natural allies. It's hard to see what role India would want to play. I mean, there are things like, you know, should India go on the UN Security Council and that kind of thing? Is India ready to play a more dominant role?
Absolutely. And I think if we were far-sighted, we would acknowledge that this is something that's coming. I mean, we're going to have to face the fact that, you know, Britain and France, some middle powers these days, have vetoes in the Security Council, but very important countries like India, Brazil, Indonesia don't. And if we're going to get these international bodies to be serious players, they've got to be more representative. And my impression is that, you know, the Indians in particular do recognise that they have a role to play in all of this. I think what is beginning to emerge, it's not quite like NATO, but you're beginning to get pacts being formed in the Asia-Pacific area, Japan, India, Australia, supported by the US. And that may be something very much of the future.
And it's interesting as well that India is sort of sticks resolutely to the sort of non-aligned route. I mean, you know, we in the West get outraged that India has not taken a firmer stance on Ukraine, but we forget that India has long-standing ties with Russia. I say that in a neutral way. So should we perhaps be more understanding that if you're sitting in Delhi or indeed in Beijing, you do have a different perspective?
Yes, well, I think particularly with the Trump administration going rogue, I think most countries, including ours, I think have got to accept the fact that we've got to develop relationships with a lot of countries and governments we don't like. And the Indians, for historic reasons, as you said, have long had, well, they used to have links with the Soviet Union, now with Russia, and they try to balance that with their relations with us, with China, with the US. And people find that irritating, but it is the world. And we've got to get into the habit of doing the same thing. You know, we need better relations with the European Union. We also need to continue to work with the US for economic reasons as much as defense reasons, and to have working relationships with the Chinese, the Indians, a lot of others. It's getting getting into a very messy, some people call it multipolar world. It's not one we're used to. Where we were cuddled up in the European Union and we relied entirely on the US for defense. And that world is gone, and we've got to rethink it.
Absolutely. So Vince Cable, thank you for coming on. I know that you were...
看完这段专访，大家是不是觉得神清气爽？这才是真正的人间清醒。今天不熬鸡汤，咱们直接拆解西方这种被害妄想症背后的3层几层逻辑。第一，西方为什么这么害怕？因为他们骨子里的信仰是海盗文明、零和博弈。在他们的强盗逻辑里，你只要强大了，你就一定会抢他们的地盘，因为他们当年就是这么干的。他们根本理解不了中国正在走一条通过做大蛋糕来实现共赢的文明复兴之路。第二，中国的阳谋到底是什么呢？凯布尔看得非常的准，咱们根本不屑于跟西方玩泥巴打烂仗。咱们在干什么？咱们正在闷声憋大招，正在绿色能源、人工智能、量子物理这些真正决定人类未来赛道上，咱们悄悄地完成了技术霸权的交接。这才是真正的大国智慧，不战而屈人之兵。第三，西方的内爆才是他们最大的死穴。正如凯布尔所说的，俄乌泥潭的消耗，北约的离心离德，政客的瞎折腾，西方其实是以肉眼可见的速度在自杀。他们疯狂地打压中国，只是为了掩盖自己内部治理混乱，彻底的崩盘。朋友们，大变局已经来了，这个世界正在从西方一家独大的单极时代走向了一个极其混乱却又充满机遇的多极世界。在这个牌桌上，谁能稳住阵脚，谁能掌握核心科技，谁才是最后的赢家。咱们中国现在最需要的是要保持最强大的战略劲力，让子弹飞一会儿。面对西方越来越歇斯底里的围堵，你觉得咱们应该是主动出击，还是继续闷声发大财？同意战略竞力的朋友，请在评论区打出战略竞力4个字，关注胤蓝智库，带你用最犀利的逻辑看透世界。别忘了点赞关注，咱们下期见。